The beginning. Okay, hello everyone. I think we're live now. Again, today, this is our second time we're joining everyone from Berlin, me and Tobias. This time, Stefan Gruber is joining us from Pittsburgh. And hello everyone in Tbilisi, in Pittsburgh, in Berlin, and everywhere else, whoever is listening to us. We are really glad to host today Stefan Gruber, and I will introduce him a bit and then give you a floor to do the presentation, and then we will open up for some discussion. So Stefan is an associate professor of architecture and urbanism at Carnegie Mellon University, where he chairs the Masters of Urban Design. His design research and curatorial practice is situated at the intersection between architecture and urbanism, with a particular focus on spatial justice and the political as articulated through the negotiation of top-down planning and bottom-up transformation of cities. Recent projects explore spaces and practices of commoning, seeking to build community ownership and resilience beyond the paradigms of the market of the state. Stefan Gruber curated the IFA exhibition, an atlas of commoning, in collaboration with Ash Plus, and guest edited the eponymous publication. He also co-authored Spaces of Commoning, Artistic Research and the Utopia of Everyday from Stamberg Press, 2016, Big Bad Modern from Park Books, and the report from MAK, Museum of Applied Arts, Vienna, in 2015 with Stealth together, Stealth Unlimited, and Paul Kurian. Stefan's work has been published and exhibited internationally and recognized by the Graham Foundation, the ULI, the ACSA, the Academy Schloss Solitude, the Viennese Technology and Science Fund, and Marguerite Schutte-Lihotzky Prize, amongst others. So, Stefan, the floor is yours. We're looking forward to a discussion with you and your presentation.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks, Tina and Tobias, for having me. It's been a kind of great pleasure to contribute and participate in this year's Biennale. I will talk a little bit about our contribution, and I thought I would basically give you a little bit of a narrative or an arc through some of my work on the Commons to set the stage for our conversation and give you a little bit of sense of how we got to kind of reflecting more specifically about the role that language plays in practices of commoning, and also more particularly what it means to also kind of translate practices and spaces of commoning into different cultures, different urban milieux, but also different languages. And so I'll try to share my screen. Let's see if that's working. Can you see my screen? All right, great. My interest in the Commons actually began to crystallize about 6-7 years ago when I co-organized an international summer school entitled Commoning the City at the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna, where I was teaching at that time. And that was really an amazing experience. We had about 40 participants, an incredible groups of contributors, including Silvia Federici, Stavros Stavridis, Chantal Mouffe, that join us for a week of workshops and debates. And that experience really opened up a new perspective for me on the possibility of co-producing the city beyond contemporary forms of domination. And this summer school was embedded in a larger multi-year research project that Tine briefly mentioned, self-commoning. And this research project brought together, again, a fairly large group of people from different disciplines, including sociology, urban geography, artists working in different media, as well as architects. And in a way, because we came together with an interest on the commons, but from very different disciplinary background. This was in a way a first experience of kind of trying to come to terms, to kind of come to common terms or common understanding, a common language when we actually tried to discuss the commons. And I would even say that, a significant part of this 2.5-year, 3-year project had to do with even kind of finding a shared language, but also articulating a shared interest in the commons. And for me, I think what was particularly interesting is that while the project was deliberately framed around the study of spaces of commoning, so exploring space both as a resource as well as a place in which commoning unfolds, in that group, architecture was actually met with a significant skepticism. And over time, I've really learned to use this discomfort as a driving force in my research and also my design practice. The other thing that I would like to briefly mention here without going into too much detail is that part of this research endeavor included a collaboration with the School of Fine Arts in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And that exchange really, I think, raised a whole series of important questions around translation between languages and between cultures. And more fundamentally, I think about the research ethos and questions of accountability and the entanglement of power and knowledge, and really led us to begin to rethink and undo methodologies of or the methodological premises of Western sciences, arts, and architecture. Now, in effect, while the commons have moved to the kind of the center or more the mainstream of debates on more equitable cities, more often than not, architects and urban designers seem to side with the dark side of urbanization. And amongst many reasons, I think architecture's dependence on large capital investment makes it naturally complicit with prevailing powers. And as a result, contemporary architecture, I think, is increasingly reduced to either a commodity in generic urban developments, as you see on the one side of this slide, or instead to signature icons competing for symbolic capital in a global attention economy. On the other side of the slide, you see the Highline Park in New York. And I use this slide because this is actually a project that I worked on while at Dylan Scofidio during the competition. And so, I also, I don't see myself as kind of being innocent in kind of being entangled in these forces. And today in my teaching, I often use the Highline also as a provocation to discuss, what good design can do in terms of gentrification and displacing certain parts of the population. Now, based on these experiences, both with the Space of Commoning project and also previous experiences in practice, I've been concerned with a series of questions about seeking opportunities beyond the influence of the market or the state, and kind of looking for alternative modes of practicing architecture, and asking whether, if indeed we shape our buildings and they in turn shape us, how architecture can possibly be more than just a vehicle to reproducing existing social relations and power structures, and instead contribute to renegotiating our social contracts. In short, can contemporary architecture ever be an emancipatory project? The quest for affirmative answer to this question has really, I think, guided my practice in the past few years. And so also, rather than turning my back on architecture, and the kind of the challenges and dilemmas that were brought about by this experience in the research project Spaces of Commoning, it made me really, I think, want to return to architecture even more, but as a way to reframe how we kind of think of design and seek or investigate the possibility of alternative modes of practice. Now, it is actually also with these questions or in mind, or at the concerned with these questions, that I also in 2006 relocated, or you could say immigrated, to Pittsburgh in the US, and found myself again in a situation where I had to translate my thinking into another language, but also another culture. And especially teaching at Carnegie Mellon University, I think heightened my awareness for the implicit biases and power relationship that are inscribed in language or languages. As I found myself as a kind of white male European at an American elite university, but teaching mostly Asian students. So in the Masters of Urban Design that I direct, we have mostly, actually, it's very international, but we have a majority of students from China and India. So kind of a convergence of all kinds of languages, experiences, which I think is on the one hand incredibly enriching, but also poses some challenges that have kind of preoccupied, have been a preoccupation in my work. It is within this, so within the Masters of Urban Design program, that I also initiated a kind of a long-term research project in a studio called Commoning the City. And this research has then led me also to collaborate on the exhibition and publication project, an Atlas of Commoning, that I will also kind of reflect on a little bit. The Atlas of Commoning is a long-term traveling exhibition by IFA, the German Institute for Foreign Cultural Relation, and it was developed in collaboration with Eich Plus, that at least our audience in Berlin, I'm sure, are very familiar with. Eich Plus invited me to kind of be a research partner and co-curate this project. The exhibition assembles grassroots initiatives in which citizens come together and pool resources in order to transform and claim their right to the city. And especially in response to a growing realization that neither the state nor the market, at least in their prevalent neoliberal manifestations, support the even distribution and access to resources. Communities actually across the world are beginning to kind of taking matters into their own hand in pursuit of a more sustainable, open, and solidary life. And so the project assembled in an Atlas of Commoning demonstrate how citizen-led projects that are often rendered marginal by dominant market measures, in fact, instrumental in building community resilience. And maybe more importantly, these projects show that these alternatives are already in the making, and when kind of put or seen together, they form a network that already constitutes a critical mass. Their collective spatial practices outline the city as commons. So this is in a way the kind of the core hypothesis of this exhibition. And for those of you who are maybe less familiar with the debate and discussion on the commons, I thought I'd just take a minute to kind of define what do we even mean when we speak about commoning. Commoning are collective practices structured around the production and stewardship of shared resources. Commoners form self-defined communities by actively engaging in the governance of these shared resources. These can be either material or immaterial goods. And the commoners also actively negotiate the rules of access and use. So beyond a mere natural resource to be found, extracted, and consumed, commons are an ongoing social practice. And this is, I think, why we also favor the active tense commoning. And here a term that has been coined by Peter Leinbau, and he also says there is no commons without commoning. So it really depends on a continued kind of practice, a continued investment and care for the production and reproduction of the commons. And maybe lastly, although often driven by everyday needs, so kind of often, in fact, everyday survival, commoning also aims at a paradigm shift or a system levels change. So there's I think also maybe a larger ambition behind many of these practices of commoning. Now, as to be expected, the process of emancipation from prevalent power structures and the articulation of a common ground beyond individual interest is never free of friction. Meanwhile, I would argue that it is precisely in the process of encountering and negotiating differences that practices of commoning unfold. And based on this understanding of the commons, the exhibition is also structured around what we call three axes of tension, or three axes of investigation that really illustrate the tensions inherent in practices of sharing. These tensions, as you can see on this diagram, are the tension between ownership and access, production and reproduction, and right and solidarity. Now, ownership and access addresses questions of property and the current shift away from a culture of material ownership towards accessing services and experiences on demand, and ask the question how we can reclaim the benefits of sharing also in the so-called sharing economy that is transforming, I think, the current economic paradigm. And also counteract kind of a hyper commodification in which all life becomes a paid for experience. It asks what alternative modes of collective ownership exist. The second axis of tension, production and reproduction, is dedicated to the modern separation of functions with respect to the domestic and the productive sphere, and sheds light onto new collective forms of working and housing beyond the paradigms of the 20th centuries that are really also founded on gender policies of domestic labor. And here we argue that we are increasingly also shifting or will shift from being passive consumers to being active prosumers in a circular economy in which we produce what we consume based on a more kind of local peer-to-peer networks of collaborative production. And From a feminist perspective, this also implies recognizing reproductive labor, so the social reproduction of everyday life, as an essential part of our economy. And I think will also, especially with the transformation of the very kind of character of work through automation and artificial intelligence and so on, I think will kind of reframe how we think about the economy, and I think bring the labor of care and social reproduction really to the center of our value system. And I think that even the way we kind of recognized essential work as part of the current pandemic maybe has really, I think, also underlined this transition or this shift. And the third axis, right and solidarity, explores the notion of universal rights in the context of global capitalism and discusses new models of collective governance that expand or extend beyond the boundaries of the nation state. I think, again, in the face of global challenges we face, one kind of central question becomes how we can articulate individual interests in such a way as to constitute common interests. And here again, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic is a good example how we are kind of learning that resilience cannot be built around notions of nationalisms, reinforcing borders, and how in a globalized world, new models of solidarity will probably become a question of survival. And this is a map that is also featured in the exhibition by Theo Deutinger that, for instance, shows all border walls that have been erected since the year 2000. And I think these are really, I think, the expression of a regressive mentality in which the failure of the market paradigm makes some people desire to return to a previous paradigm, the one that was based on the nation state. But I would argue that going back in time is probably not a viable option. And I'm also saying that, as you all know, we are kind of holding our breath until Tuesday because what is at stake in the elections here in the US is really, I think, also one of a regressive versus a modality of moving forward. So in this kind of last tension, I think that we need to also really kind of reconsider the relation of the local and the global, not as an either or, but one in which we begin to reframe what it means to kind of be local and global at once. I think that Bruno Latour has been talking in the context of the current exhibition on critical zones that is, I think, still up at the CKM in Karlsruhe. About the distinction between living off the land versus inhabiting the land, and I think that really, I think, is also in line with this notion of cosmopolitan localism. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about the exhibition, but the spectrum of projects featured in this atlas range from the German Mietshäuser Syndikat, the tenement syndicate that is working towards permanently removing residential property from the real estate market, to projects like the Yoshina Cedar House, a project initiated by Airbnb in rural Japan, in which the care work of a village community is wrestling with the logics of platform capitalism and also corporate philanthropy. And I'm just showing these two as a kind of example to also emphasize that by no means are we only featuring ideal projects in this exhibition. On the contrary, we're really kind of interested in prompting a conversation, also a debate, a polemic around what commoning can or does not actually or should not entail. And in the face of these kind of contrasting, sometimes contradictory positions, we really want to emphasize the kind of the process of negotiation that is inherent in commoning, and that is also always situated in a translation or negotiation between ideals and the messiness of everyday life. I believe that's really in a way it emerges or unfolds. And now the exhibition is a traveling exhibition that opened in Berlin, and we were able to show it in Pittsburgh last summer, and we'll continue traveling for 10 years. Unfortunately, currently it's kind of stuck somewhere in near Mexico City, where it was supposed to be on display this spring. But the idea is really that it's a kind of the atlas is a growing atlas to which we add new case studies in every host city, and therefore also the atlas will continuously be reconfigured and transformed. And the idea of an atlas was inspired by Abi Warburg's Limousine Atlas, in which he visually juxtaposed diverse artworks, aiming at teasing out differences and commonalities. And so maybe the kind of other important reference to the notion of an atlas is that it's irrevocably associated also with Europe's imperialistic foundations. Maps, in a way, are part of Europe's long history of colonization and ongoing dispossession. But Atlas was also the Greek titan who, for his part in the Titans' revolt against the god, was then forced by Zeus to support the heaven on its shoulders. And so Atlas is one who bears a heavy burdens. And I think it's this kind of the convergence of these different meanings of an atlas that I think played into our kind of thinking about an atlas, what it would mean to put together an atlas of commoning. And I think it's also important, we were very kind of aware that we started this atlas from mostly kind of a Western perspective, although the initial 25 cases also include very kind of international initiatives. But it is only as it travels that we will, in a way, kind of discover and also hopefully kind of challenge and displace this kind of this somewhat inevitable kind of Eurocentric starting point. And as a way to kind of translate this idea of just the atlas being something that is open-ended, the display of this kind of core piece, the atlas is something that is, flexible, can be continuously rearranged, and in fact, because it's it has a limited amount of space, as we add new cases, will also kind of be decentered or redefined. So we really tried to kind of materialize or kind of this notion of negotiation and co-production within practices of commoning also in this exhibition. This is also why it's called an atlas, so one of many possible atlases to come. And we're really hoping to kind of see this exhibition as it continues to travel as more of a platform for the exchange of knowledge and experience, rather than kind of pursue a kind of a singular understanding of commoning. In addition to this, the centerpiece, the atlas, there's a whole series of initiatives or projects that are featured more in details through large models that were built under the direction of Rainer Hehl at the Technical University in Berlin. There's a series of thematic islands produced by Archibald that kind of situate the debate and these case studies in a broader historical and societal context. But finally, there's also a handful of artistic positions and contributions that offer a more visceral entry point into this discussion. Here, for instance, you see Manuel Herz's contribution, Right on Carpet. That is a carpet inscribed with the Declaration of Human Rights. But as you can see, it also doubles as an event space with an exhibition for discussions and workshops and so on. And as you access the carpet, you enact the ritual of removing your shoes and bending down, and then you kind of are invited to actually engage with the actual wording of these universal declarations. In the Pürzberg edition, we have also added a small library that is also continuing to evolve, but really to make this exhibition also a place to study and kind of dive deeper into some of these ideas. Now, this is so the spaces of commenting and atlas of commenting have been two kind of moments where my research and explorations of practice of commons have crystallized. I wanted to briefly share two, or actually three, kind of moments in that on that journey. Very different kinds of experiences that I think have drawn my attention to the role that language has, what it means to come to terms, and also really kind of acknowledging that in a way the common always takes place in translation, the translation between these kind of differences, different experiences, subjectivities, and languages, and in a way mark a kind of a starting point for articulating common interests. This is a diagram from J.K. Gibson Graham, the feminist economic geographers, who have exposed capitalist modes of production based on wage labor and private property as the mere tip of what they call a much more significant and diverse economy. So they, in a way, kind of criticize that when we speak about the economy, it always is presented and we kind of conceive of it as this monolithic thing. And with this diagram, they really try to kind of describe the cracks that exist within the economy once we really take the time to describe what actually, how economic relationships structure our everyday life. So in this iceberg above the waterline, you see what is probably kind of conceived of as the mainstream economic activities that are typically shaped by monetary exchange, but below the water lies an abundance of transactions and forms of labor that are typically rendered marginal by dominant market measures, but things like barter, reciprocity, gift, self-provisioning, informal lending, and so on, that in fact all equally define our everyday transactions and our social relations and power structures. And so Gibson Graham advocate for reclaiming the economy, taking back the economy by constructing a new language of economic diversity. They say that one of the problems is that we actually need to render visible these kind of these economic practices that keep the iceberg afloat. And it is only by kind of reframing the language that we use and becoming more cognizant, more aware of these alternative narrative and practices that arise from diverse economies that we will begin to reframe the economic institutions that coexist in any social formation. Now, the second kind of just experience that I want to briefly mention is one that I have had by visiting a initiative called the Sweetwater Foundation on Chicago's south side. I've had the opportunity to visit twice. And kind of engage with an incredible project of a regenerative neighborhood development that began with urban farming, but really has kind of become a very layered and rich kind of initiative of trying to reclaim the land. Has been experiencing immense disinvestment. And Emmanuel Pratt, who you see here, the founder and initiator of the Sweetwater Foundation, does something really kind of fascinating every morning when the team comes together at 8:30 in a house that they have kind of fixed up, a former vacant house. They call the Think Do house. They actually so they come together to kind of just see, what work needs to be done today and who will kind of help with what. They have a significant team of people who work there, volunteers, students from universities and school who contribute to this grassroots initiative. But they actually spent the first, 15, 20 minutes of every day defining terms, coming to terms, kind of describing what they actually mean when they talk about public good, or what it means to speak of this neighborhood as blighted, and really through this definition begin to articulate a different language, a different set of vocabulary that I think is really essential in beginning to also develop a collective vision of another possible future. And so it's made me really aware of also the importance that language actually plays, the finding of a new language as a starting point for seeing latent potentials in places that otherwise sometimes seem hopeless. And the third kind of experience is actually from a book that has had a great influence on me. It's a piece of social fiction written by P.M., an author that is actually Hans Wittmer, a Swiss author that also has been really, I think, influential in the kind of revitalization of cooperative housing movement in Zurich. And in the 1980s, he wrote this small social fiction called BOLO. And early on in BOLO, he writes, and I quote him here, I quote a passage, "Of course, there are limits, but why should they be limits of pleasure and adventure? Why are most alternativists only talking about new responsibilities, almost never about new possibilities? One of the slogans of the alternativist is think global, act local. Why not think and act globally and locally? There are a lot of new concepts and ideas, but what's lacking is a practical global and local proposal, a kind of common language. There has to be some agreement on basic elements so that we don't stumble into the machine's next trap. In this regard, modesty and academic prudence is a virtue that risks disarming us. Why be modest in the face of impending catastrophe?" And so all of these three kind of short experiences really emphasize the role that language has as a starting point to come together, or to kind of not see language as something that is just passed on, but something that is actually actively shaped in the everyday as we speak to one another, as we seek to kind of understand what we actually mean, and also question really our respective understanding when we assume that we have share a common language, but maybe filter that through very different experiences and subjectivities. And so these kind of moments have made me want to focus or dedicate some time to think more in depth about the multiple languages that we speak, also the role that obviously kind of a English and a kind of an Anglo-Saxon dominance in academia and cultural production has on our modes of reflection and production. And this, in a way, was the prompt or the trigger to participate in the Biennial with a project that we call A Dialogue Must Take Place, precisely because we don't speak the same language. And this is really an online project. It's a series of contribution at the beginning of a conversation that reflects on the situated histories and plural etymologies of practices of commoning, and also the possibility or impossibility of translating even the simple word or the word commoning, and suggest that if indeed other worlds are possible, they will only emerge from a plurality that can be either old or new, indigenous or from situated in urban communities, feminist, and from environmental movements alike. And so I invite you to kind of just explore this website, adialoguemusttakeplace.org, in which you will kind of discover at this point 13 contributions, but this is a living platform that can also grow over time, where we have reflections of the kind of the cultural implications of the commons, commoning, articulating commonalities from many different countries and 5 different continents. I'm just kind of zapping through some of these contributions to give you a little bit of a sense of the range of languages and cultures that are included here. And kind of are the beginning of that kind of conversation of what it means to come to terms when we speak about commoning. I wanted to just end with a quote that also kind of situates these practices in response to the pandemic by Sonia Renee Taylor. We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal, other than we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction. And in the full text, this list goes on and on. She continues, "We should not long to return, my friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all humanity and nature." And so I would argue that one way to begin stitching such new garment is also to define a new common language without reducing our difference to a common denominator, but really celebrating them as a foundation for other possible worlds. And I will stop here, and hopefully we can kind of have a little bit of a discussion.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for your very, very interesting input, and also to understand the way or the journey of your research into the topic. It was very helpful. Well, I will also check parallelly if there are some questions from the audience. And I would give the opportunity, whoever is watching, just to encourage them to ask questions. Yes, I think I have a question already. We can start. What do you think? Well, I had some points that I wanted to bring up. like wanted to ask you a question about the biennial itself, like this biennial, because it became so much detached from. We use this common language, and when we called it a common biennial, it became so kind of not local anymore. So I wanted to ask you, like, what was your impression when you read an open call, or how did you understand this country, or you knew anything about Georgia, and how did you perceive this topic? Because it's a topic that is very broad, and it has been researched and discussed a lot everywhere, but it's something new for us in Georgia.
Yeah, so so actually, I had the opportunity to go to Tbilisi as a kid, so I have some kind of relationship to Tbilisi. I did spend 4 years of my childhood in Moscow, and at that time we kind of traveled quite extensively throughout what was the Soviet Union at this time, and I was pretty young at that time, but nonetheless, I do feel a kind of a connection and do have some memories of that first visit. But I think it's really interesting to kind of in a way embrace the fact that we are mostly kind of online, to kind of open up this biennial and basically try to kind of maybe through these conversations that are happening, think about at the same time what is specific to the history and the current kind of social and political situation of Georgia, but nonetheless also recognize that we are all struggling, I think, with a lot of similar issues, partly because these are global forces that we're kind of exposed to. Be it climate change or kind of neoliberal capitalism. In fact, I think it's really what I've experienced doing field work in my research is that many of these citizen-led initiatives are often so invested, but also consumed by everyday survival and struggle, is that there is actually little time to kind of recognize how many other people are kind of struggling with similar issues. And so I think having an exchange about what we have in common and what is also different and specific to our everyday life, I think is a really important step. And this is, in fact, so when we brought, for instance, this exhibition to the Atlas of Commoning to Pittsburgh, we hosted a whole series of conversations with local initiatives. And we had a lot of kind of interesting feedback of, on the one hand, initiatives being excited to see what else is happening and being inspired by some of the work, and also understanding that they're not alone, but also by kind of initiatives, local initiatives that we were sure they knew each other and kind of knew what the kind of that they only kind of connected through, in a way, a more kind of outside view. I'm still fairly new to Pittsburgh, and kind of bringing people together that don't necessarily actually have the opportunities to meet and talk. And so I think this recognizing what an external view, a different perspective actually can also contribute to a very local culture is important. And my sense, just following the biennial from far away, is that's the potential of it. That's what it can actually do. And I describe how in our little introduction text how strangers or new views are always unsettling at first. So maybe it's normal that people are like, oh, has nothing to do with our reality here. Yeah. But that shaking up things, unmasking, the what we're so kind of our habits is the first kind of step towards maybe also reframing certain habits and customs.
Yes, thank you very much. Bobby, maybe you have some comment?
Yeah, I kind of want to go back to the project in a way. Because I think one of the very points, actually the main idea of your project is to like take language or different languages and try to make it at least comparable in a way, which is on one hand very interesting because by doing this or by making this in this case, it's not an atlas, it's more like a dictionary in a way. But you can also explore and discover other ideas of commoning. And I'm pretty sure that all these cultures that brought this different languages also have different ideas of the commoning. And then on the other hand, it's also interesting to do this as we are working and researching in a field which is kind of used to kind of not being so specific with the language in a way, also when it comes to an aesthetical language. And I think this point, and this is the reason why I strongly underline the idea of your project, this is a very important point, as we all know that this codification of language and codification of architectural aesthetics of the urban and of the commoning in itself is something that, and I remember you writing about it also, something that is always in danger to be commodified. So once you start to, let's say, get in conversation with other people and try to explore the possibilities of commoning, maybe also at some points the history and what we can learn of it to like develop new practices, there's always, and I think this is something that we all have in common, whether we are in Pittsburgh, Berlin, or typically there's always already someone who tries to commodify the language and the aesthetics to do the opposite of commoning in a way. So I was wondering if you would probably, I think in your little input there was already hints towards that, but it would be nice to hear a little bit more about this point in a way.
Yeah, thanks, Tobias. I mean, I think that's a great question, and I almost feel like there's maybe a few questions embedded in that in an observation. I mean, I think one is that I think commoning is, as you said, always subject to appropriation and reappropriation. And that's why it's so important that we don't see it, that we understand it as a social practice that needs to be ongoing, right? It's like, it's not something that we ever achieve, but it's something that we aspire to. And as soon as we lean back in a way, I think it will kind of erode. It will lead to kind of its subversion in one way or another, right? Whether it's kind of the accumulation of power or getting comfortable within this little niche that commoners or community has created for themselves, or in fact by being absorbed by the market and so on. So that I think makes it so challenging and also exhausting, because we can never kind of rest, I would say. And in fact, like a number of the project or initiatives that are shown initially in Berlin, for instance, do not even exist anymore. So, I mean, they're really, this is in a way the challenge, but also the beauty of doing this for 10 years. I mean, the exhibition will continue traveling for 10 years, is that it's such a long time span that it also, I think, really reveals how precarious some of these struggles and spaces are. But I think the other aspect, more specifically when it comes to language, and is of course that I'm particularly aware of it. I've taught in a public Austrian university for 11 years before joining now a private American university, and how the force of also academic capitalism. I mean, in a way, I mean, when you talk about also, I mean, I think that the role that research plays and the English language plays, because it's so dominant in its ability to kind of broadcast or diffuse language, that I think it automatically, I think, imposes hierarchies and that I think are hugely problematic. And so that's made me, I think, really self-conscious about, what does it even mean for me to be in the US as a European doing research on commoning, and where, I'm hoping that with a project like that, it's in a way, I see my role as much more kind of in the background of just opening up spaces for communication and learning in a kind of very basic way. And so, maybe just to illustrate that, one question that we've kind of struggled with in the making of this project is like, should we even have an English entry, right? Should we define what commoning means? And we've had several attempts of doing this, and then we failed because we always thought that would, in a way, somehow kind of automatically play a kind of a more dominant role. And so what we decided to do is that under commoning, you can click on it. There's just an invitation for other people to contribute their perspective on, or their understanding or definition of what commoning might be in their language or culture, but avoid kind of going back to, the kind of English idea of the commons.
Decolonize the commons.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I think they are and will also be critical voices, whether, that can even, the decolonization of the commons can even be undertaken by a person like me. That is, in a way, also in a privileged situation. Even being able to afford doing a project like this is already, in a way, poses a number of problems.
Yes, I find it extremely interesting also, like, to explore this different definitions of commons in different languages. Probably, like, many people are not even aware of that the practice that their everyday practice is a commoning practice. I'm sure, there are probably, like, a lot of places in the world where this can be discovered, which I find really, really extremely interesting. And that's why this bringing up the topic of the language is really important, I think. Also to understand what does this mean in different realities, right? I can shortly reflect why we, the Biennial team, started discussing this topic. Because we kind of, our initial idea to found this festival was to create a common platform where different actors, different policymakers, or just citizens would come and talk together about urban problems in Tbilisi. So actually the Biennial idea was based on the problematics of the city that we faced, and also lack of cultural activities in architecture. And what we observed from the first edition, that our maybe also an ideal or romantic idea of we create a platform and everybody will come together and discuss, was so, we noticed that people didn't understand it this way. So we kind of thought, okay, we have to now force even more to bring them together by asking this question of what do we actually have in common? Because the understanding of common in our own reality in Georgia. It's quite struggling, also because of the history of the Soviet Union and then the breakup and the takeover of the market economy, where it's extremely individualist society right now. And also, like you brought up the topic of the ownership, which is very important in this topic, right? Because, for example, like the housing stock in Georgia, it's 99% privately owned. So, like, to make a common decision on a housing block, for example, that needs to be renovated, it's like super difficult. So I only wanted to reflect on that, how different our perception or our how we address this topic in Georgia. It's very different, I think, how they would address it in Berlin, for example. So that's why I find this, like the language topic, really important, to not to kind of frame this commoning in one kind of, not to open the topic more. So yeah, that's just my
yeah. I mean, this is, I spoke briefly about the fact that I have so many international students, and I get this a lot at the beginning of the semester. Like, oh well, commoning, that sounds. We don't even have this word in our language. And then, when we dig a little deeper, often kind of more traditional kind of forms of sharing and kind of mutual support networks come up. And I think that tension is also something that between the kind of the past and the present tradition, and also kind of a projection towards the future, is something that comes out really well, I think, in the different entries of a dialogue must take place, because ultimately, I think if we kind of pay attention to the language, we might also kind of reframe it in order to then kind of, on the one hand, build on traditions, but not in a kind of a nostalgic way of kind of, returning to a past that is not possible, but really also kind of acknowledges the new forces that are at play in kind of reframing. I mean, even questions like ownership, for instance. I mean, it's interesting that you described, for instance, the housing blocks, because I mean, modernity has created these housing blocks no matter where, right? I mean, we have them in projects in the US. I mean, China is kind of covered with them. And I have a lot of students who are actually working on, what does it mean? And I think so. It's interesting for me that in a lot of these cases, they have reverted to private ownership, but because of the architectural typology that they're actually collective housing, they have to, in a way, come together in order to add an elevator or kind of improve the energy performance of the facade. And I think that's really interesting, that the architecture or space itself imposes a certain kind of negotiation, because in contrary to the American dream, this kind of freestanding single family suburban house, right, where you can do whatever you want. This is actually not possible at all.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, this is my question, maybe to steer back to you. At the same time, I feel like there's some things that are inscribed into space that make the coming together almost inevitable. And I find that, especially also now that we're all stuck on Zoom all day, it's a really interesting question, which role does architecture and spatial practices actually play to enable or force us in a way to negotiate our differences.
Question to us.
No.
Poppy is a practicing architect.
Well, being a practicing architect in a group of 5 people raises so many things about commoning. I mean, talking about this what is like an outcome of the COVID situation. What's the role of architecture? This is like one of the big question mark flying above all of us. But I mean, maybe I'm trying to slip away a little bit from the question, but it has to do with this, because one thing that we observed now in the last month, especially like in the two, I would say, harsher months in March and April, tendency a flight to the countryside. I mean, that was a phenomenon that was I'm not sure how much it was in Tbilisi, but we had the news of like 400,000 people leaving New York, and like a huge part of them going to the Hamptons. And we have comparable things here in Berlin. I mean, a region that has been called by people working there itself in their kind of self framing the New Hamptons, rural areas around Berlin.
And they're all in the Uckermark.
Exactly. Yes. I was trying to avoid to call it by the name. But I mean, that's a thing that we think a lot about, also as we as architects working in Berlin are actually working a lot there. And the word commoning is a word that we hear pretty often in that case. And it's always kind of a difficult thing to like judge the social practice, the private social practice of people. But I mean, I'm trying to formulate a question out of that. But I remember that in your exhibition, for example, and also in the text, as far as I know them, there was quite often the connection to the urban, or as you said in German, die Stadt. And I mean, I don't want to open like a too big topic on that, as I think that a village, for example, is for me also urban. It's maybe less dense, and also the social connections are probably a little bit more far. But by practicing and by commenting, it can be. But I'm super skeptical on like the romantic idea of commenting, which is don't get me wrong, it's not a critique on what you are doing. It is more or less the outcome of reading and seeing your work in the last years. Because, like, to put it short here, the commenting can also be hurtful. When you think of a housing project with like 40 or 50 people, I mean, there is a lot of debate, and you have to also go through this in a way. You have to be ready to get into this conflict at any time. So, I mean, again, not kind of a question, but more or less another chapter of the book in a way. But it would be great to hear your thoughts also about this. So I don't think that the rule is necessarily the alternative coming from COVID-19 and thinking about commenting. I also think it's possible, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in response to this, the urban flight that we're experiencing right now, I mean, I would say that probably the lives that these people live in a more kind of remote or less dense environment is probably still very urban. And so, I mean, I think that this notion of the local and the global, or the urban and the rural, does not necessarily kind of apply so much any longer. I mean, the only reason I think that we kind of emphasize more the urban in this Atlas of Commenting is simply because we were trying to get away from an Elinor Ostrom kind of notion of the commons as being kind of situated in a more rural context about the sharing of natural resources, and emphasize it as like a social practice. And I think that when you, so basic, I mean, and it's somewhat in kind of a broad strokes, but to clarify that once you kind of try to translate that into kind of an urban context, it automatically becomes more immaterial, because in a way we co-produce the city every day, but only few people benefit from it, right? I mean, even just by kind of being on the sidewalk and kind of, I mean, what Jane Jacobs described, right? It's a form of co-production, or Henri Lefebvre describes this as the kind of the co-production, the everyday production of space. But I mean, I think the other part that is really important in your comment is about the role that conflicts play, and this is something that I feel like is difficult to work through and kind of embrace. But I mean, I think that is the only way we can keep a distance from more kind of nostalgic notions of community, as you know, like, oh, we all get along, and it's and even as something that we would aspire to, and because I feel that in a way, one of the reasons our democracies, I mean, definitely the US is, I think, in such a crisis, is because we have lost the ability of understanding democratic processes as the encounter of conflict, of differences that cannot be overcome, right? And nonetheless kind of agree that at least the kind of the negotiation of these differences will lead to there's a common interest in kind of accepting the result of a debate that actually needs to be, I think, about consensus rather than consensus. And I think that the idea of consensus suggests that we erase our differences, that we come to a same agreement, and consent, and in contrast, it kind of, I think, acknowledges that, yes, maybe we come to a decision of how to move forward, but that doesn't mean that I agree with you, right? I still am of a different opinion, and there will be a conflict that will remain. But nonetheless, it's important that we move forward together rather than kind of begin to kill each other, right? I mean, and kind of that's the kind of, so I think that understanding of, and you know, I'm really kind of drawing on Chantal Mouffe's understanding of democracy as kind of agonistic pluralism, where democracy is simply the way of kind of disagreeing without killing each other, but having a set of protocols or an institution that allows us to kind of make explicit our differences without erasing them. And I think there's so much of a notion that we kind of need to erase our difference, kind of this idea of consensus that is, I think, dominating or kind of sidetracking our understanding of democracy, that I think is a real problem. So how do we create a culture where conflict is embraced and it's valued, right? It's like, even if it's so fundamental that I see you as my enemy, I mean, not you, right? Like someone else as an enemy. I think is a really important, is something that is difficult, and it actually requires, I think, constant practice. And that's why I think commoning comes back, because I feel like actually it needs to be practiced in the everyday. And I think commoning is something that is very much rooted in the everyday, and the banal kind of, you know, like negotiating at home who is going to clean up and do the dishes. I mean, all of this kind of stuff, I think, is already I think a form of commoning that then we kind of need to be able to apply to multiple scales.
But I just wanted to add a short comment, or maybe an idea of mine, because I see commoning as, of course, commoning is a practice, as it's ongoing, it's an everyday practice, and I think the benefit of commoning is the space itself, and not only the actors who are creating the space, because they constantly change, and it doesn't become also this closed community. So, like in my reflection, it's more about a space where actors might change, but the space still keeps producing every day. That's for me the difference between kind of a community or commune, which is kind of also very closed, with lots of rules sometimes.
I totally agree, and I think that's where the newcomers, and you know, Stavros Stavridis obviously talks about this a lot. The newcomers are so important, because the newcomers, the ones that speak another language, are so essential in questioning the social contract, the rules, and views and access to shared resources. Somebody who comes in and be like, well, why is this like this, right? Or I want it differently, will kind of keep the negotiation, I think, ongoing and alive. And as soon as I think, a community is fixed and there is no space for newcomers, then inevitably, I think it leads to the kind of consolidation or even kind of abuse of power. And that's a really tricky thing, right? It's like, because at the same time, it's exhausting to continuously renegotiate things. And so I think it's a balancing act of how do you kind of define the boundaries and keep these boundaries nonetheless porous, I think is a key kind of aspect of thinking about the long-term sustainability of commoning.
Yeah. This is really, really inspiring and interesting topic. I think we could go on forever to talk about this. Do you have some?
Are we at the end already? Yeah? But one last question.
Okay, no, I was looking.
And, it's only one for me, so I'm in the middle of the day. I'm not as tired as you are, probably.
Well, I'm fine. More
no, it's fine. It was just. Go ahead.
Well, I try to be quick. I mean,
sorry.
During your input, you mentioned your own skepticism towards architecture as what it means in a classical sense, maybe. And now I want to kind of blow you out of this a little bit. So, I mean, there's now a lot of talk like COVID made something with us. And I think even though we are still too less in a way, but I think there is a certain awareness that there is, I mean, in German we have this term Gestaltung, and which means not comparable maybe to commoning. It's not really one-to-one translatable, but there is a lot which has to be gestalted in the very near future, like I would say almost now or better yesterday in a way. And it's not probably the classic questions of architecture. It's like really a total rethinking of the urban also as a built structure, but also, and like more important, the way how we live in these communities, I call it now, even though we have to be careful with the packaging, of course. But I wanted to ask you, where do you see the transformation of the field of architecture and urban planning also in the next couple of years, facing these challenges that I don't even need to name or as a single case in a way, because I think we all know what we are talking about: climate change. So is there an idea already? I mean, it's an overwhelming question, of course, but.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, there's kind of several possible answers to this question, and I mean, I think one fundamental one is that we need to kind of enter or kind of recognize and accept a kind of a post-development paradigm. I think that this notion that success is built on growth. And and architecture has so much, and especially urban design has so much been about kind of expansion. I think is obviously not sustainable. But at the same time, I think that the number of urban dwellers until 2050 will double. Until we reach kind of 10 billion. Inhabitants on this planet. So, but especially in the, let's say, the kind of global north or the so-called West, I think we need to kind of really come to terms with what it means to degrowth. I mean, or kind of reduce in our footprint and so on. And so, I think because architecture has been so much about building anew and all of that, I think we need to really radically kind of rethink what is our role here and what can we actually, what is our value proposition? I mean, what do we have to offer? And maybe related to that, I think that we need to kind of expand how we think about design, not as something that is related necessarily to a material or spatial product only, but is about being facilitators and kind of moderators in coming together and kind of articulating visions about the future, and then kind of incremental steps to go there. But so I think it'll be a much more kind of process-oriented practice. But this doesn't mean that, space doesn't play a role. I mean, in my mind, I see design or Gestaltung much more in a way as I do believe that space is essential in bringing people together. It can be really catalytic and even kind of beginning a process. And so I think if we shift our attention to that, then the spatial interventions are not the end product, but they are more the beginning of a kind of a process that then kind of helps or enables community engagement, giving voices that are typically not at the table, also including them in the conversation and so on and so on. And I think that's where actually spaces play a huge role. But likely these spaces these Gestaltungen will be less photogenic, and therefore they will be not as kind of easy to kind of commercialize or commodify and so on and so on. So I think we also need to think about how do we emancipate ourselves or detach ourselves from lots of money, basically. And I mean, I am saying that, maybe this is one of the reasons I've kind of drifted towards academia in the course of my career. I did not enter I didn't graduate imagining that I was going to go into academia, but academia provides me the privilege to actually work on these things and nonetheless, feed my family and pay the rent. Mm-hmm. So we actually also have to redesign, I guess, like even the economy behind design that doesn't necessarily depend on delivering a product. And actually, I would say that the design field, not architecture, but service design and human interaction design and all that, they have been much better at, I think, expanding their field of practice than architects and urban designers have been. I think that, like if you think about human-centered design, for instance, that practice, a lot of this theory is what we have been or are doing as architects, but we have not been, I think, successful at framing that as a value proposition that we can also get paid for.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Would be great.
That's my two cents on an overwhelming question.
Yes, thank you so much. Any more comments? I checked the audience, but there are no questions for now. I would slowly bring our conversation to the end if there are no more comments or questions from both sides. And I would like to thank you, Stefan, very, very much for this really inspiring and interesting conversation, all the projects that you've done and you're continuing. You're in the practice of commoning.
Well, thank you for having me again today. And maybe if there is an audience out there, it's always difficult to tell. But again, it's an invitation to check out the project site, but also kind of take an active role in this conversation and just shoot us an email with your thoughts of ideas. They don't need to be a fleshed out essay. They can also be much more kind of, I guess, informal and casual reactions and thoughts.
So I really hope that there will be like more engagement from the audience and from others, and there'll be probably more contributions as well. And I really hope that we meet soon physically somewhere, and we continue this topic also and don't stop here. And let's see
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, me as well. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye bye. Take care.
And